What if events went differently in the MCU? What if the Hulk went berserk in Hulk 2008? Welcome back, my fellow watchers of the multiverse, to another brand new Marvel's What If episode. And in today's episode, we're going to be diving deep into the Incredible Hulk. This is one of my favorite, if not my favorite MCU movie. It's one of the first MCU movies ever made, and I really can't wait to get into this because we don't have a lot of what ifs on the Incredible Hulk, and I think going into this particular what if, things are going to get insane. So that being said, my fellow watchers, grab some popcorn because it's 2024. We're going into a brand new season, brand new what ifs, brand new content. I can't thank you enough. Grab popcorn, grab whatever you have to do, because this what if is gonna get juicy. With that being said, let's dive into the brand new Marvel's What If episode. Location: Ross's lab. Ross's dreary lab was not the kind of place to make headlines. It would even be a miracle if it acquired a pin on the map. So, naturally, a grand occurrence should have been exciting for workers and past-buyers alike. However, at several feet, this green Goliath was perhaps too grand of an occurrence. Emotions spiraled from sheer disbelief to pure horror almost as quickly as the creature's body morphed into a giant and unleashed chaos on anyone close enough to be targeted and spotted. As Ross and Betty, along with other lab attendants, scurried for their lives, it was evident to them that the plan had failed ultimately. The original idea did not feature in several casualties or account for the damages to their high-tech equipment. In its mundane budget, it did not cater for irreplaceability, displaced joints, or bloodbaths. In essence, it was less graphic, but this was no time to indulge regrets, but to find a way to keep their heads atop their necks. Betty dashed for the radiator and mained it, intending to channel it at the creature again. After all started with the radiator, so it should end with it. In truth, it started with requesting her boyfriend to present himself for an experiment, all in the name of the advancement of science. She had compelled him by adding that if it was successful, it would be a catalyst in her father's career. She described the invention as cutting edge, revolutionary, the good Lord's work. Eager to please Banner, her boyfriend turned center of attention, agreed. They had strapped him in to the stretcher and briefed him on what they hoped to accomplish with the experiment, which was upper strength, super speed, and heightened abilities in general. They thought it would calm his nerves when they told him that they had successfully run the experiments on guinea pigs, but it only set him further on edge to deduce that it was the debt for human trials. Eventually, what kept him strapped down was not the restrictive straps that they had used, but his devotion to his relationship. The experiment had commenced with a bright light, reflecting directly into the eyes, forcing him to shut them. When the radiator started up, he could hear and feel the rays humming through his body. It was a new feeling as expected. He started hearing his heartbeat louder, and when he thought it was safe to open his eyes, he found that the light was still in his eyes. But for some strange reason, he could bear it. Something had changed. No sooner he had thought that he suddenly blackened out. It was not dramatic or climactic. He simply lost all his vision, hearing, and consciousness in general, and when he regained them, he would find that his life had changed in more ways than he could be signaled out. when he would learn that he had terrorized the place in such a terrifying manner, he would break down. But at the moment, he was not lucid enough to reason. He was not the one in control anymore. Betty waited till no one else was in her line of fire, which was harder to do considering the ruckus all around her. But eventually, a slim window presented itself, and she took it. She fired up the radiator, which they had shut off when Banner initially started reacting adversely to the experiment. Once the machine whirled to life, it called the creature Banner's attention to her. Everyone else ran out of the room and observed the situation from the safety of the two-way glass. Terrified, Betty immediately cranked it up to maximum capacity and unleashed its glory onto him. Banner groaned and was thrown back into the stretcher by the force of the machine. Betty struggled to keep herself up, but she did not turn the radiator off, so it kept unleashing. The radiation seemed to have gotten to her as well, but she did not run out of the room. She brought herself to her knees and curved her body into a ball as she was not feeling too fine. Then, without warning, the device went off and the radiation ceased. Just like that, the room was plunged into total darkness. Knowing the facility was enough, Betty was certain that someone had cut off the power supply to the building in general. She didn't bother about that too much, but what was more concerning was whether her actions had accomplished what she had hoped for. When she could not hear or sense movement in the dark room, she took a leap of faith. Weak and frail, she allowed her eyes to adjust to the darkness and then crawled over to Banner. She noticed that Banner had collapsed and shrunken back to normal, and strained her eyes till she noticed that his body had turned gray and pale. She wondered why the radiation had changed his color, first to green, then to gray. As she placed her hand on his forehead to check his temperature, she was astonished to notice that her hand was pale as well. She immediately understood that she had been affected by the radiation as well, and quickly determined in her mind to not allow herself to morph into whatever creature Banner had become. She felt her way through the darkness with calmlessness and precision, and feebly dragging herself over to some sedatives. In a jiffy, she administered first Banner, then herself. That ended the drama for the day. The thought that perhaps a threatened father could carry more fury than the reputed woman flashed through Ross's mind. Unethical ways to salvage the situation his daughter, Betty, had ended up in. He had long buried his morals under the weight of necessity, and he conceived the most treacherous thought in his head already. Finally, he considered giving an eye for an eye, but not in the conventional sense, that he would instead give some other eye in order to retrieve his daughter's eye. Retributed substitution. He did not have to think too long or hard to recognize that the only scapegoat available was Bruce Banner. Banner was in his daughter's shoes, but Ross did not know if Banner's love would be sacrificial enough as to give itself for his daughter. There was only one way to do it. Ross promptly called Banner to his office. In Ross's office, Banner conducted himself with the most approval-seeking demeanor he could. Ross thought it suitable as he wanted Banner as willingly and defenselessly as he could. Ross brought out a first aid kit and set it before a meek Banner. He commanded Banner to stretch forth his hand, covering up by saying that he needed to run some checkups to see if Banner's blood was contaminated. Banner meekly objected, equally explaining that he was advised by his doctor to get as much rest and preserve as much strength as possible, so a donation would leave him depleted. Ross did not insist, but simply asked Banner to get well soon. That simple gesture made Banner's day, as he believed his girlfriend's father was finally warming up to him. Banner's wistful assumption could not have been farther off from what was happening in that father's head. Betty arrived a little late to her outing with Banner, and he was far from pleased. Banner rambled on about her waning dedication to their relationship, which she had proven with her tardiness. On another hand, Betty did not take it sitting down. Literally, she retorted by threatening to leave if he persisted with the nagging. When he quieted down, and the silence became too tangible, too loud, and carried on for too long, Betty took her seat and roughly apologized. When the waitress arrived to take their orders, she brought back 2 glasses of water along. They placed their orders, and on the way back, the waitress unwittingly knocked a glass into Banner's lap. The waitress, who was not aware of what she had done, had already turned to get their orders. Already agated from the argument with Betty, Banner was unable to control his temper, and let out a deep shout in anger. Everyone in the diner was incredibly astonished at the outburst. Some pulled their loved ones a little closer. Others simply observed with a rapid intention. Once the waitress turned around and realized what the matter was, she started to apologize profusely, but Banner cut her short with another unforeseen shout directly in her face. His veins started bulging and his skin turned pale. His eyes watered and turned a deep red, and with those very eyes, he made eye contact with the waitress. The waitress was petrified but dared not make a move. Sensing what was about to happen, Banner charged towards the bathroom, causing the waitress to let out a scream in the process. On the way to the bathroom, he tripped a few times and struggled to compose himself. He had barely locked the door before he completely turned into the gray giant. He fought hard with himself, but could not control the urge to destroy. He wrecked the walls, the sinks, and went door to door kicking each one down. When he got to the last door, he kicked it down like he did the others, but this time the stall was not empty. There laid a terrified little boy, burying his head into his hands and crouching down to protect himself. The boy lifted his head slowly and let out a whimper at the sight he saw. He was a child and could not control the tears his eyes let out, or the cries his mouth released. Though the hand he had placed over his mouth showed he was trying, the creature approached the little boy with eerie calmness, and it must have been the child's lucky day, because just at that very moment, the Grey Hulk left and Banner returned. Realizing the state of the room and just what he had done, Banner was immediately sobered. He extended his hand to lift the little boy up, but the boy sprang up and dashed to the door, unlocked it, and ran out, all while screaming. Once Banner stepped back into the diner, he noticed that all the eyes were on him. He figured that they had heard the ruckus he had created, and even if by chance they had not, then the little boy, who was no longer in sight, would have narrated it efficiently. Several pair of eyes stared back at him coldly, but the most unforgivable pair belonged to Betty. She walked up to him before he got to her, and before everyone in the room accused him of having an agenda to her reputation and her career, she added that it was the most humiliating day of her life and slapped her 2 palms together, as though she was pleading, asking him not to make it any worse. She added that she doubted he could accomplish it, as bad luck seemed to follow wherever he went. Banner tried to apologize, mend his wrongs by paying for the damage he had done, but right before Betty stormed out, she coldly told him not to bother paying what he had already been paid for, dryly asking why he thought the cops were not already there. In his heart, Banner knew she had spoken in a fit of rage. In his heart, Banner knew the people would never be able to guess the truth of what happened to him. So, in reality, his worry was not for his reputation, but for his relationship. But even more than that, his worry was for his dignity, or for whatever he had left. Banner narrated his decision to donate some blood in order to find a cure for what had befallen to both him and Betty, and it was like music to Ross's ears. Banner had made it the decision right at the diner when Betty failed to have his back, or understand that he was simply protecting her like a normal boyfriend when the water spilt on her. He expected her to understand that the outburst was unintended and unplanned, and that was the effect of the radiation at work in his body. What befuddled him more was that the radiation was also at work in her body, but had not yet had its day of manifestation. He dreaded the day it would happen. Banner decided to handle it with maturity, when she would manifest, and support her through it. Betty had let Banner down, and had still gone ahead to humiliate him. The solution to Banner was to uproot the problem from its roots, which meant finding a cure to his issue. What Banner did not realize was that the experiment would require several pints of blood, and that would jeopardize his already fragile health. But in the grand scheme of things, it didn't matter to Ross, who was driven by madness. Without wasting time, Ross drew the first 2 pints of blood, which, as expected, weakened Banner. Ross assured him that he would be fine with a little rest, and went ahead to draw a 3rd pint. He gave Banner something and sent him home with the assurance that he would be fine. Ross was having a hearty laugh over drinks with a partner. The matter being laughed over was Banner. They had been recounting the past events and preparing for future ones. Ross told his partner that he felt triumph at that moment as his scheme had finally taken off. He believed that Banner had fallen hook, line and sinker into the trap, so their careful planning from the beginning was worth it. From Ross's demeanor, it was unclear to his partner which one intoxicated Ross more, his liquor or his bliss. But in his state, Ross continued to count how brilliantly he had pretended when the radiator malfunctioned weeks ago. He was pleased that Banner had no idea that it was all calculated to the last detail, even when Betty was the only one left in the room with the mutant Banner. It was Ross who had shut off the power supply to the entire building in order to protect his little girl. Ross was boasting of the success of the scheme and his accomplishments, and he recounted events with such fine detail as seen in movies only when someone is eavesdropping. Again, Ross and his partner laughed heavily for the umpteenth time that evening. Then Ross heard a light knock on the door. His partner ducked inside a room to take cover, while he cautiously approached the door. He opened it but did not see anyone. There was indeed someone at the door. It was none other than Banner, and all that he had just heard staggered his mind more than the blood loss. He wondered how long he would have been played for a fool if he had not found out the truth by chance today. If he had not passed out in Ross's inner corridor when Ross was putting away the blood samples, then the next day he would have returned like a fool, seeking salvation from the devil. If he had not come to while their conversation was underway, then he might have missed it entirely and woken up ignorant of what had transpired while he was out. If he had not staggered out and quickly found a spot to hide after closing the door a bit too hard and unwittingly drawing their attention, then they would have known that they knew, and they would have easily overpowered him. He considered it pure luck that he had seen Ross's true colors, but he took it as a sheer misfortune that he had to learn that his Betty was in on it. The one Ross had been planning with Betty, and he watched as her face lit up while Ross narrated their victories again and again. As it was, due to the blood loss, his body was too weak to morph into the giant. He was shocked to learn that it was possible, but was grateful to have a clear mind to scheme for a way forward. Tomorrow was a new day, and he swore to make everything unravel once he was himself again. Location: Ross's lab. Banner appeared the next day to get his blood samples drawn. Ross showed up and was set to draw the blood, but Banner stopped him. He demanded to see Betty before continuing, in spite of all the convincing Ross tried to do. Eventually, Ross had to call Betty in. When she arrived, Ross attempted to draw blood again, but Banner still did not yield. He wanted to have a conversation with Betty. Ross was puzzled, but at this point, he started to doubt Banner's motives. He found the acute refusal suspicious, but he chose to wait and see. However, Ross deduced that after losing 3 pints of blood just the previous night, he was almost certain that Banner could do no harm, even if it was his greatest desire. Ross excused them and stepped out for a quick smoke. What Ross did not know was that Banner had come prepared. Banner's strategy was simple. If he got himself agitated enough, the mutation would happen. He had experienced it, exhausted and weak as he was. He could barely sleep due to how angry he was, and that made him even angrier. By the end of the night, his neighbors had demanded to have a word with him. He had brought chaos down upon the house. Banner spoke directly without mincing words. As he spoke, he walked towards the door and locked it. He told Betty everything he knew about her betrayal and laid his cards flat before her. He asked her to confirm it if it was true or not. She lied. He grew angrier. He told her that he had heard everything from the previous night through a chance of series of events. Her face grew pale, but she lied again. He grew even angrier. He yelled at her, and she buckled under pressure. Out of fear, she gave out new facts that he had not even heard the previous day. She narrated how she approached him in the first place for this reason. The truth was that she and her father, who was a scientist who needed a big break, had been scoping potential scapegoats. Banner had fit the bill, and he had no known family to question or kick up trouble for them if anything happened to him. So she did a little flirting, got into a relationship, earned his trust, and convinced him to present himself for the experiment. It started to make sense to Banner. Her pushiness to have him do the experiment was not ordinarily. Her behavior at the diner was not ordinarily either. She had no feelings for him, which was why she could not hide it any longer. She had been a fool to think that he knew her well enough to know she did not mean what she said. He had also been a fool to think he would support her while she manifested into a mutant. At this point, his body started bulging in odd places. Then, another thing occurred to Banner. He turned back to the petrified Betty and asked her why she had not yet transformed. She was reluctant to tell him more, seeing how angry he had become, but she was in a dilemma. Silence or lies would make him grow angrier and bigger. She could not lie safely because she did not know how much he knew in the first place. Hence, she decided to tell the truth. She revealed that the botched experiment was not really botched. It was all staged. They needed blood samples and contained significant increased levels of gamma radiation, and nobody was willing to try it on their own body, as its outcome was unknown. So they tricked Banner into thinking that the experiment was to heighten his senses, when truly their goal was to expose him to the gamma radiation, observe his behavior, and then draw the blood. Thus, Betty had not morphed into a giant colorful mutant herself, because she had not in any way had been affected. She had only put out a show for the other lab attendants to not grow suspicious. As she tried to explain further, a punch from his now giant hand went right into her gut. Then, suddenly, her head was rammed through several doors. Immediately, Ross started banging on the door from outside. Banner let him in by kicking the door down. He picked up Ross in one hand and picked up Betty, who was too weak to resist, in another hand. Then, he clapped both of their heads together with one firm move. That did the trick. They passed out. By the time Betty came to her senses, she could see Banner, who had now come back to normal, sitting in the middle of the room. His back was to her, and she thought to use this chance to escape and return later to free her father. She paced herself and finally tried to jump. She was met with a hard hit on the face, on the knees, and generally in front of her. Then she stretched forth her hand and discovered to her horror that she was in a glass box. She looked around, and behind her was her father, Ross, who was still unconscious in another glass cage. She tried the next rational step. She cried out for help. She screamed bloody murder, but even Banner could not hear her from where he was seated. Banner had ensured that their boxes were soundproof and to send in food and send out junk. He considered that his last favor to Ross and Betty, the fact that he had made the place wherein they would be spending the rest of their lives, was his last favor to them. They had intended to use him for research. They had treated him like a guinea pig, so he decided to show them how it was done. In those glass boxes, they would never sit idle. He had his own research to do, and he found his lifelong lab rats. He crossed his legs and poured himself a drink, the same one from which Ross and Betty had the previous night. The tables had turned, and he was the one with the sense of triumph in that moment. He had succeeded in making the fish feel like the in charge for taking a bite out of the bait, out of free will, when, in turn, he was the master who sank the bait, controlled the hook, and reeled up the line. Nothing delighted Banner's heart more than the thought that he had just pulled an Uno reverse card on life. Ross and Betty had no idea that coming from a nameless, homeless background, he had, for an uncomfortably long time, nursed the desire, an identity that would set him apart from the world, and they did just that. They created the Grey Hulk, and they served it to him on a golden platter. That thought made him consider spray painting their glass boxes as a reward. Like they say, he had just played the players. His madness was guaranteed to no end. And that is going to be what if the Incredible Hulk went berserk in The Incredible Hulk 2008. What if Bruce Banner was tricked by Betty and Ross? What if Betty had no emotions to Bruce Banner? Now, what did you think of this insane Marvel's What If fanfiction? It was based on The Incredible Hulk, the 2008 film, but I wanted to add my own creative flavor to it, and I think that's what I did for this particular What If. This is one of the first 2024 Marvel's What If fanfictions, so if you guys do enjoy these videos and want to stay all up to date with the latest content, do make sure to subscribe, like, share, and turn those notifications on so you and your friends are all up to date with the latest content. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video. Take care and have an amazing day. Peace out.